Imagine being traded like an object, discarded by the one who should have loved you most, and then finding the strength not only to survive but to choose your own destiny. This is the story of Ava, a young woman who was given away, but who refused to be broken. Instead, she fought back against betrayal, embraced a new life forged in wild lands, and discovered a love that saw her as whole. If you've ever felt lost, abandoned, or silenced, Ava's journey will remind you that true freedom comes from within, and that no one can ever take away the power of choosing yourself. Before we dive into Ava's unforgettable journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Here we explore stories that touch the soul, stories of courage, transformation, and hope. Don't miss out on powerful tales that inspire you to embrace your own strength and choose your own path. Subscribe now, and join our community of warriors who refuse to be broken. The wind whispered harshly through the cracked earth, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant rain that never came. Ava stood silently in the middle of the small clearing, the sun beating down on her bare shoulders, already sunburned from long weeks spent wandering between neglect and despair. Her arms hung limp at her sides, her hands trembling faintly, not from cold or fear, but from the emptiness that had hollowed her out. Her father stood nearby, a tall man weathered by years of hardship, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. His eyes avoided hers as if they carried a shame too heavy to bear. The thick leather reins of his horse pressed hard against his knuckles, white and tight, betraying the trembling he tried to hide. Ava did not cry. The well of tears had long since dried up, sealed off by the relentless cruelty of her life. She was not brave, she was numb. Every hope had been chipped away by bitter words, nights spent hungry and alone, and the cold rejection that haunted her like a shadow. The air was thick with silence, except for the soft rustling of dry leaves and the faint creak of her father's boots shifting on the cracked ground. Without a word, he motioned toward the man waiting across from them. Cale was nothing like Ava had expected. His face was calm and unreadable, framed by dark hair that fell in loose strands over a high forehead. His eyes were sharp, alert, but not cruel. He stood straight, steady, like a mountain carved by time and storm. He didn't smile, nor did he frown. He simply watched, waiting. Ava's heart pounded, not from hope, but from the cold certainty that she was being traded like a possession, a thing with no value but what others placed on it. 2 bundles of tanned pelts were laid on the ground, their rich brown hides shining faintly in the sunlight. Horseshoes clinked against each other in a small pile. A pouch of worn coins changed hands. That was the price of Ava, a girl who had become invisible to her own blood. Her father avoided her gaze until the very last moment. Then, without hesitation, he turned and mounted his horse, urging the animal forward with sharp kicks. The horse surged ahead, carrying him away from the girl he had once called his daughter, from the life he no longer wished to claim. Ava stood alone, the dust swirling in lazy spirals around her feet. The sun scorched the back of her neck. She felt neither anger nor sorrow, only the raw, aching void of being discarded. Cale stepped forward, his boots making soft impressions in the dust. From beneath his worn cloak, he withdrew a folded blanket, thick hand-woven, smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. He held it out to her with steady hands, not as a gift or a claim, but as a silent gesture of acknowledgement. Ava stared at the blanket, unable to speak or move. Her throat was dry, her body weighed down by invisible chains forged from years of neglect. Finally, almost mechanically, she reached out and took it. Without a word, Cale turned and began to walk away. After 3 steps, he paused and glanced back over his shoulder. His dark eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, not with command, not with pity, but with a quiet invitation. She followed. Not because she trusted him, not because she wanted to, because she had nowhere else to go. And as she stepped forward, beneath the heaviness in her chest, a tiny whisper fought to rise. Not broken yet. The trade was finished. But her journey was only just beginning. The path stretched before them like a wound, cutting across the earth in long, jagged lines. The sun hung low now, an orange bruise on the horizon, bleeding light into the clouds. Dust clung to Ava's skin, coating her throat, filling her nostrils, settling in her lashes like ash after a fire. It tasted like abandonment. Cale walked ahead, silent, his tall frame cutting a solitary figure against the dying sky. His shadow stretched long and thin across the cracked earth, flickering slightly as he moved around brush and twisted trees. His steps were purposeful but not hurried, as if he knew exactly where he was going, but wasn't in any rush to get there. Ava followed at a distance, keeping just enough space between them that she could stop and run if she needed to. But where would she run? Back to her father, who had traded her for a few coins and iron. To the settlement, where she was only ever another burden. There was nothing behind her but absence. And nothing ahead but uncertainty. The only thing certain was the weight of the woven blanket pressed to her chest. It still smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke, grounding her in something that didn't quite feel like safety yet, but at least wasn't cruelty. Her legs burned with each step. She hadn't eaten properly in days, her stomach folding in on itself like dry paper. The worn soles of her boots had long since split, letting small stones press into the raw skin of her heels, but she bit down on the inside of her cheek and kept going. What frightened her most was not the hunger, or the ache, or even the not knowing. It was the silence. She kept expecting something, a command, a barked order, a hand reaching back to drag her along, rough and impatient. But Kale said nothing. When the ground beneath her gave way slightly to loose shale and her foot slipped, she flinched instinctively, bracing for the sharp sting of words, or worse, the strike of a hand. It didn't come. Kale only paused. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head and glanced over his shoulder. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they didn't hold the sharpness of cruelty or the dullness of indifference. They were steady, alert, patient. He didn't offer her a hand. He simply waited. Ava stared at him, chest rising and falling quickly, confusion creeping up her throat like heat. No help. No demand. Just choice. And that terrified her more than anything else. Slowly, she pushed herself upright again. Her ankle throbbed slightly, but she didn't let it show. She brushed the dirt from her palms, even though it clung stubbornly to the scrapes on her skin. Kale gave a small nod, not approval, not encouragement, simply acknowledgement. Then he turned, and continued walking. As dusk deepened into night, they came upon a small rise overlooking a thin, winding creek. The water was sluggish, barely more than a reflective strip of mud, but it was enough. Kale knelt, scooped water with practiced movements, and drank without looking at her. The stars began to emerge, one by one, cold and distant like tiny scars stitched into the dark. Ava stood on the edge of the creek, staring at the reflection of the moon trembling on the water's surface. She wanted to disappear into that trembling, to scatter, to dissolve. Instead, she sat down on the edge of the bank, drawing her knees up, wrapping the woven blanket tightly around her like armor. Kale lit a small fire, efficient and silent. The flames crackled softly, smelling of juniper and something sharp and sweet beneath the smoke. Without a word, Kale reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a piece of dried meat and a folded cake of what looked like flatbread. He set it down between them on a square of clean cloth, not offering it directly, but leaving it there as plainly as one might place stones in a garden. "Eat," he said simply, his voice low, deep, but not commanding. Just stating a fact, like saying sky or wind. Ava's stomach twisted painfully at the smell of food, but another older instinct, mistrust, made her hesitate. What did he want? But Kale didn't press. He didn't watch her, didn't reach for her, didn't shift closer. He simply sat cross-legged on the other side of the fire, turning his gaze to the shadows in the trees, his jaw set, his entire posture that of someone used to waiting for storms to pass. And in that silence, there was something dangerous growing. Something that frightened her more than cruelty ever could. Respect. No one had ever waited for her before. No one had ever offered her something without demanding something back. Her fingers shook slightly as she reached for the bread, tearing off a small piece and chewing it slowly. It was dry, but sweetened faintly with something, honey maybe. The meat was tougher, salty, sharp on her tongue. And with every slow chew, something sharp and buried deep inside her, something crushed and silent for years, shifted. Just a little. It wasn't trust yet. But it was something. They sat there like that, two figures by a flickering fire, separated by the flicker of flames and miles of difference, yet somehow connected by the one thing neither could say aloud: loneliness. As sleep began to pull at her eyelids, heavy and thick like fog, Ava heard Cale speaking under his breath in a language she couldn't understand. His words were soft, rhythmic, like prayer or memory. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Ava didn't fall asleep fearing what would happen next. She fell asleep wondering if something better might actually be possible. Night had settled fully now, thick and absolute, except for the low crackle of the small fire Cale had built. The stars hung sharp and endless above them, scattered like shards of broken glass across the black sky. The air smelled of smoke, dry earth, and something softer, cedar maybe, faint in the weave of the blanket she held tightly against her chest. Ava sat curled on the opposite side of the fire, arms wrapped around herself, drawing the blanket up around her like armor. It was coarse, worn in some places, but warm, warmer than any kindness she'd been given in years. And that terrified her. The blanket was simple. No embroidery, no bright colors. Just earthy brown threads, thickly woven, with one faint stripe of red winding through it like a vein. Something about that stripe unsettled her, like it was stitched with memory. It didn't belong to her, yet here it was, draped over her shoulders, warming skin that had only ever known cold. Why had he given it to her? Men didn't give things without asking for something back. Not the men she knew. They gave with hungry eyes or quick tempers, with fists behind their generosity. Kindness, to them, was a trap. But Cale didn't look at her. He sat on his heels across from her, feeding the fire with slow, deliberate movements. His face, half lit by the orange glow, was carved with lines of quiet, not cruelty, not pity. Just silence. Like he was living half in this world and half somewhere else entirely. Ava glanced at him through the fringe of her tangled hair. The bruises on her arms, fading but still visible, seemed to burn in the light of that fire. For a moment, shame rose like bile in her throat, hot and bitter. She didn't deserve warmth. And yet, here she was, wrapped in it. She lowered her head, breathing in the scent of the fabric, a mixture of old smoke and human care. Her fingers dug into the folds of the weave, as if by gripping it tightly enough, she might squeeze understanding from it. Cale finally spoke, voice low, rough like stones dragged through water. It belonged to my mother. The words struck her like a slap, not because they were cruel, but because they weren't. No bitterness. No accusation. Just fact, offered gently, like someone holding out a small bird, afraid it might break if squeezed too hard. Ava's throat worked, but no sound came out. Why would he give something like that to her? It's clean, he added after a beat, misreading the panic in her eyes. No lice. I wouldn't give you something unclean. That wasn't what terrified her, though. Dirt she could handle. Filth was familiar. What she couldn't handle was the meaning of it. This wasn't payment. It wasn't a chain. It wasn't possession. It was care. A stranger's care. Quiet. Steady. Expecting nothing in return. Tears stung the backs of her eyes suddenly, fierce and hot, but she bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to stop them. She would not cry here. Not now. Not in front of this man who didn't demand it, didn't deserve the mess she carried in her bones. Cale didn't press her. He didn't explain further. He only fed another small branch into the flames, his posture still, his gaze steady but distant, as if he were speaking partly to her, partly to the memory of someone else entirely. The fire crackled between them, the only thing moving besides their breathing. For the first time in her life, Ava didn't know what to do with the thing that had been given to her. Not the blanket. Not even the food. The thing was respect, and she didn't know where to put it inside herself. She wanted to throw the blanket off. To reject it. To return to the sharp comfort of loneliness and control. But she couldn't. Not with the faint cedar scent curling up her nose. Not with the gentle way Cale had said, "It belonged to my mother." Not with the first embers of something deep, dangerous, and unfamiliar kindling inside her. Trust. The first thing Ava noticed about the village wasn't the people, it was the quiet. Not the kind of silence she was used to, sharp and cruel like a slap held just behind someone's teeth. This was different. It was a living, breathing quiet. Not absence. Presence. Kale led her through the camp without a word, his steps measured, his eyes sharp. The others noticed them, of course. Heads turned. Conversations paused. But no one spoke. No one mocked her. No one reached out to shove or claim her. That alone felt strange, almost dangerous in its unfamiliarity. Children peered at her from behind leather tents and drying racks of meat, their dark eyes curious but not cruel. The women, some with long braids streaked silver, glanced at her with unreadable expressions, murmuring soft words she didn't understand. Ava's whole body felt raw, exposed, like she was walking barefoot on broken glass. She pulled the woven blanket tighter around her shoulders, using it like armor, even though she didn't feel worthy of its warmth. What was she to them? A stray? A burden? Another foolish, broken thing dragged out of the white world, shattered and useless? She kept her eyes on the ground, focusing on each careful step. Dirt. Grass. A broken bead from someone's necklace glinting faintly in the sunlight. Kale stopped near a wide, low structure made of woven reeds and mud, its entrance shaded by hanging strips of leather. Without a word, he motioned for her to sit. Ava hesitated. The part of her that knew survival whispered, "Don't make yourself visible. Don't draw attention. Don't sit where you don't belong." But Kale didn't insist. He just waited, steady and patient as always, like a stone in a river refusing to be moved. Slowly, she sank to the ground, folding her legs beneath her. The dirt was warm under her skin. An older woman approached, her braids thick with red thread, her face lined with time and loss. She crouched beside Ava, not close, but near enough for Ava to smell the clean scent of sage on her clothes. The woman's gaze scanned her with the precision of someone who had seen too many wounded things, deciding whether this one was worth the trouble of saving. Ava didn't speak. Words didn't seem welcome here, not yet. Not from her mouth, shaped by another language, another world. The woman said something softly to Kale, a question maybe. Kale answered with a few clipped words in return. The woman nodded once, sharply, then rose to her full height. Ava prepared for dismissal. Instead, the woman disappeared into the structure, returning moments later with a small clay bowl of water and a strip of soft cloth. Without ceremony, she knelt and gently, without force, took Ava's hand. Ava flinched. Not from pain, from memory. Rough hands. Hands that grabbed. Hands that took. But this woman's hands were different. They were calloused, sure, but her touch was careful, practiced, like someone who attended to wild animals, knowing that sudden movements break fragile things more than sharp ones. The cloth was dipped in the water and pressed to Ava's scraped palms. The sting of the dirt being washed away was sharp, but it was clean pain, not punishment, not cruelty. Healing pain. Tears gathered again behind Ava's eyes, hot, sharp, unwelcome. She bit them back, jaw clenched, shame rising in her throat like bile. Why should she cry now? She didn't deserve tenderness. Not after everything. Not after what she'd become. The woman didn't flinch at the dirt beneath Ava's nails, didn't recoil from the bruises faintly shadowing her arms. She simply cleaned, one stroke at a time, steady as sunrise. Around her, the village returned to motion. Soft murmurs of conversation resumed, fires crackled, laughter rose faintly from somewhere far off. It was like the world had made space for her, not by invitation, but by simple, quiet acceptance. Ava's whole body felt foreign to her, like she'd been scraped clean, raw and unfinished, sitting in a life she didn't understand. But no one told her to leave. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't in the way. She simply was. Among strangers. And somehow, that felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever been. The morning broke quietly, with thin silver light stretching over the ridge like cautious fingers. The camp was waking, but gently. No loud voices, no barking orders, only the soft murmur of conversation, the hiss of water being heated, the faint rhythmic scrape of someone sharpening a blade. Ava sat where Kale had left her the night before, still wrapped in the thick woven blanket. It was no longer just protection from the cold. It was something else now, a fragile link to belonging, or maybe just the illusion of it. Her hair was a tangled mess, a wild snarl falling over her shoulders, streaked with dust and knots formed by weeks of wind and neglect. She hadn't touched it in days. Maybe weeks. What was the point? Pretty things were for girls who were loved. Brushed hair was for daughters not sold like cattle. Cale approached her that morning in his usual way, not softly, not loudly, just present steady, like an oak tree appearing at the edge of a path you didn't realize you were walking. He crouched down before her, a small object cupped in his palm. It was a comb. But not just a comb. It was beautiful in its simplicity, carved from dark wood worn smooth by years of use. Along its spine delicate swirls had been etched, not ornate, just careful. Loved. The teeth of the comb were slightly uneven, as if reshaped by hand over time. It was old yet whole. Ava stared at it, confused, not daring to move. Another trap? Another strange offering that would come with a price later? Cale didn't push it into her hand. He just held it, open palm, as if offering something alive. It was my mother's, he said, voice low, almost distant, like he wasn't speaking to her but to the space between memory and regret. She made it herself. Shaped it with her knife. When she was sad, she carved things. Ava's heart thudded against her ribs, sharp, quick, frightened by how gently the story was told. Sadness wasn't supposed to be spoken about. Not like that. Not like it mattered. Cale's eyes didn't search her for a reaction. He wasn't performing. He wasn't pitying her. He was sharing. She said, "Sadness isn't weakness. It's just love wearing a different face." No one had ever spoken about sadness to Ava like that before. It had always been shameful, something to bury, to choke on, to hide. Now it sat between them, weightless yet vast. For a long time, Ava didn't reach for the comb. Her fingers hovered, uncertain, shaking faintly as if approaching fire. What would happen if she took it? Would it hurt? Would it trap her? But Cale remained exactly as he was, crouched steady, offering without demanding. Finally, her fingers curled around the warm, smooth wood. It was lighter than she expected, shaped perfectly for a hand smaller than hers. She held it gently, like it might crumble. No words were spoken between them for several breaths. Then, Cale did something that completely unmade her. He shifted slightly closer, reached forward, and very slowly, with the care of someone approaching a wild animal, began to untangle a strand of her hair with his fingers. He didn't yank. Didn't pull. Just eased the knots free, starting near the ends, working upward. Ava's throat closed with the shock of it. No one had ever touched her like that. No one had ever touched her without taking. The weight of that gentleness was unbearable, but she bore it anyway, blinking hard against the sting in her eyes. He worked carefully, methodically, until he could pass the comb through that first section, slow and sure. With each pass, her hair loosened, falling soft around her shoulders. Not beautiful yet. Not smooth. But cared for. For the first time in her life, Ava felt not like an object being cleaned up, but like a person being kept. Not fixed. Not repaired. Just seen. And when Cale finally leaned back, letting the comb rest lightly in her lap, he only said one thing more. "You are not broken." No command. No expectation. Just truth. The comb sat warm in her hands. And for the first time since she could remember, Ava wasn't sure if she wanted to cry, or scream, or hold on to this moment so tightly that nothing could ever take it away. But she did know this. She would never let anyone, not even herself, believe she was worthless again. Not now. Not ever. It happened in the smallest way, like a crack in ice barely audible beneath your feet, unnoticed until everything breaks. The morning was cool, a soft mist curling low across the grass, making the world around them feel gentler, blurred at the edges like an old memory. Birds sang high, sharp notes cutting through the fog. Somewhere behind her, a woman was humming as she ground corn, the soft rhythmic shhh of stone on stone pulsing steady like a heartbeat. Ava sat alone by a small ring of stones near Cale's shelter, knees pulled to her chest, chin balanced on the ridge of her arms. The blanket was still around her, threadbare in places, but holding her together better than she could by herself. Kale was near, sitting cross-legged, his fingers busy with something in his lap, thin strips of leather and bone, a small carving knife balanced loosely between his calloused fingers. He wasn't watching her. He never watched her, not like others did, not with hunger or ownership, but with that strange stillness of his, like a wolf that wasn't hungry yet but might be thinking about winter. Then came the sound. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sharp or sudden. Just a soft curse under his breath, and the unmistakable snap of something breaking. Kale held up what was clearly meant to be a tool of some kind, now snapped directly in half. His lips pressed tight in frustration, but he didn't speak. He just stared at the two broken halves in his hands with this slow, deep sigh that sounded like someone who'd been too tired for too long to bother being angry anymore. It was nothing, really. A broken piece of craft. Probably important. Probably something he'd worked hard on. But the way his shoulders dropped, the way he just looked at it like life had broken one more useless thing, that defeated, bone-deep "are you serious?" kind of expression. It hit Ava in the ribs in the strangest way. A sound slipped out of her mouth before she could stop it. Soft. Quick. Almost too quiet to hear. A laugh. Tiny. Barely there. But it was real. Her hand flew to her mouth, shock rising in her throat like a fire. Laughter wasn't safe. Laughter got you noticed. Laughter got you punished. Laughter was for girls with places to belong, not stray things dragged through dust and hunger. She braced herself, waiting for Kale to react, to frown, to bark at her, to ask what was so funny about broken things. But Kale didn't react that way. He didn't even turn to look at her fully. He just glanced at her from the corner of his eye, his brow arched slightly, one corner of his mouth curling upward. Not a full smile. Just an almost smile. Enough to show that he'd heard her. Enough to say, "I saw that." No shame. No cruelty. Only companionship. It was unbearable, how much that almost smile did to her. It broke something in her chest, not the bad kind of breaking, not the kind that hurt. The kind that lets light through cracks that have been dark for too long. She coughed, trying to turn it into something else. A mistake. Just a breath caught wrong. Just a cough. Just anything other than joy. But Kale said quietly, "Good." That was all. Good. Not because she was supposed to be grateful. Not because he wanted to make her soft. Just because laughter belonged to her, too. Ava looked down at her hands, curling her fingers into fists, confused by the sudden warmth crawling beneath her ribs. It felt traitorous, this lightness. She didn't deserve to laugh. Not after the things she'd lost. Not after the shame that lived under her skin like old bruises. But in that small broken breath of laughter, something else was born. A beginning. A thread of who she might have been, might still become, curling soft and bright beneath the ashes of everything she thought was gone. The tool in Kale's lap remained broken. But Ava? For the first time, maybe not. The world smelled of wet stone and pine that afternoon, heavy with the promise of rain. Ava had grown used to reading the sky by now, the way the clouds moved in sheets, curling like fists or drifting loose like smoke. But this day, her eyes weren't on the sky. They were on the woman slumped by the edge of the stream. She hadn't seen her at first. Just a scrap of pale fabric caught on the broken branch of a fallen tree, fluttering like a warning. Then, a shoe. Half sunk in mud, the heel twisted unnaturally. And then the body. The woman was breathing barely, her face streaked with dirt and dried blood, hair tangled with leaves. Her dress was once fine, pale blue now turned brown with earth and old stains. One arm was pinned awkwardly beneath her, the wrist swelling in shades of purple and sickly yellow. But the worst was her eyes. Wide open. Wild. Terrified. Not of Kale. Not of Ava. But of something else she'd already seen, something she hadn't yet escaped. Ava froze. Every part of her screamed, "Don't get involved." Broken things meant trouble. She was a broken thing, and she knew better than anyone what happened to people who tried to save others. It never worked. It only got you punished. But Kale was already moving. He didn't hesitate. He crouched low, steady and slow like a wolf approaching something wounded, not with hunger, but with care sharpened by experience. He murmured something soft in Comanche, something Ava didn't understand, but it sounded like safe. The woman flinched hard at the sound of his voice, scrambling weakly, her cracked lips forming sounds that didn't yet shape into words. Panic flickered across her face like lightning flashing behind clouds. "I'm not going to hurt you," Ava said quickly, her own voice dry, strange, alien in her throat. For a second, the woman's wild eyes fixed on her. Another white girl. Recognition. Maybe a thread of fragile trust. Maybe not. Cale tore a strip of cloth from the edge of his shirt and pressed it against the gash at the woman's hairline, working quickly, efficiently. Ava noticed how carefully he kept his other hand in plain sight, making no sudden moves, as if he understood exactly how terrifying men were to women in pain. Ava knew that fear too well. "She's hurt bad," Ava whispered, stepping closer. "Soldiers." Cale didn't answer. His jaw tightened just slightly. But then, the tracks. Ava saw them, boot prints along the mud, deep and heavy. Not moccasins. Army boots. Panic curled hot in her belly. Whoever had done this wasn't far. And wherever this woman had come from, she'd been running. "Help me," Ava said quickly. Not a command. A plea. Together, they lifted the woman gently, Cale taking most of the weight, Ava steadying the broken wrist with trembling care. The woman whimpered once but didn't scream. She was too tired for screaming now. Branches scraped against Ava's legs as they moved, the weight of the woman awkward but not impossible. Ava could smell her, sweat, fear, blood, something sour underneath. But what haunted her most were those eyes, flicking between the trees, always behind them, always watching for what might come next. They didn't speak as they moved back toward camp. The rescue wasn't heroic. It wasn't noble. It was necessary. It was two broken things carrying a third, not out of glory, but out of stubborn, exhausted humanity. As the mist began to rise from the ground, hiding their trail, Ava realized something terrifying and beautiful all at once. For the first time, she wasn't just being rescued. She was part of the rescue. And that felt dangerous. And alive. The storm didn't come from the sky. It came from boots. Heavy, deliberate, echoing off the stones and through the shallow valley like the beat of war drums. Soldiers. 5 of them. 6. Maybe more. Ava could smell the leather of their uniforms before she saw them. The sharp stink of sweat mingled with brass buttons and too much arrogance. They came not with the panic of men chasing prey, but with the slow, cold certainty of men who knew they would win. Cale stood in front of her, broad shoulders squared, his hand resting loosely at his hip where his knife was sheathed. He didn't draw it. Not yet. The calculation in his eyes wasn't born from fear, it was strategy. But Ava saw the flicker of it beneath. He knew what this was. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. An ambush. At their center, the leader of the group rode forward on a gray horse, straight-backed, his polished belt catching the weak sunlight like a smile. His mustache was trimmed too neatly. His boots, too clean. His eyes, too empty. "You," the officer said, gesturing lazily toward Cale. "Stand aside." Cale didn't move. "This land is under the protection of the United States Army," the officer continued, as if reciting from a script he barely cared about. "Which means you, savage vagrant, whatever you are, don't belong." Ava's fists clenched at her sides, nails digging into the tender flesh of her palms. Don't belong. The words hit harder than fists. Harder than hunger. Because she knew that feeling too well. The twisting, gut-deep shame of not belonging anywhere. Cale's voice when it came was steady, soft, almost dangerous in its control. "This woman was attacked by your men. We found her near the stream." "Did you?" the officer murmured. His gaze slid to Ava like grease across a blade. "And what about you, girl? Did you find her, or were you part of the taking?" It took Ava a full second to realize what he meant. Part of the taking. They think he attacked her. That Cale, who hadn't even touched her, who had given her a blanket, food, a comb carved with kindness, was just another predator in their eyes. Rage flooded her throat. Hot. Blinding. She wanted to scream, to spit, to tear their smug uniforms into strips. But Kale didn't move. Not when one soldier dismounted. Not when rough hands grabbed his arms. Not when they twisted his wrists behind his back and bound them with thick leather cord. Kale didn't resist. The betrayal wasn't a surprise to him. But to Ava, it was a blade between the ribs. Slow. Brutal. Carving up everything soft she'd built since that first night by the fire. They didn't see Kale's strength. They didn't see his gentleness. They didn't see his restraint. All they saw was brown skin, braids, bone necklace. Enemy. Ava's legs wanted to run. Her mind screamed at her to disappear, to let this pass, to fade like she always had when things got sharp. But something else rose up instead. No one had ever stood for her before. Not truly. But now, she realized he had. Quietly. Always. And they were going to drag him away like an animal. Kale locked eyes with her as they bound his wrists. His gaze wasn't desperate. It wasn't afraid. It was asking her one silent, impossible question. Are you going to disappear now too? The soldiers began to lead him away. His feet kicked up small clouds of dust with every step. Eleanor, the woman they'd saved, had been carried off already by another group, and Ava didn't even know if she was alive. And suddenly, Ava knew one truth. No one was coming to save them. Not the settlers. Not the army. Not God. It was her. Just her. And that terrible shaking realization tasted like blood and lightning in her mouth. For the first time in her life, she didn't flinch backward. She stepped forward. And she followed. The camp was asleep, but Ava wasn't. She sat beneath the thin cover of a leaning juniper, fingers curled tight around the woven blanket like it could anchor her in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. Somewhere far off, an owl called, low and mournful. The moon was almost full, brushing everything in silver, making even dirt look like glass. The soldiers had taken Kale at dusk. No trial. No explanation. Just rope and rough hands. He hadn't fought. He hadn't begged. He'd looked at her once, only once, as they dragged him toward the edge of the hills, toward the outpost, toward whatever cruel justice men like that invented for men like him. That one glance was why she was awake now. Not because it asked for help, but because it refused to ask. And that was worse. Because for the first time, someone had cared for her without wanting anything in return, and now he was going to disappear because of it. She'd known cruelty. She'd known hunger. But this feeling, this crawling alive thing under her ribs, this was injustice. And injustice didn't sit quietly. Her stomach twisted at the thought of the soldier's eyes. Cold. Flat. The officer's smirk. His lazy posture on horseback like all the world was his to cut apart. Her hands trembled, rage crawling up her arms like vines, choking, suffocating. She could run. She could vanish into the wild. Leave Kale. Forget him. It would be the smart thing. The safe thing. It was what her father would have told her to do. Stay small. Don't get noticed. Don't be brave. But something inside her wouldn't let go of that look Kale had given her. The quiet trust in it. No orders. No desperation. Just, are you with me? Ava pressed her fists to her mouth, biting the skin to keep from making a sound. The firelight of the distant camp flickered faintly over the hill where they dragged Kale, now just embers in the night. No one was going to save him. No one was going to save her, either. Unless she did it herself. She stood slowly, the blanket sliding from her shoulders, forgotten now. The comb Kale had given her was tucked inside her dress, pressing gently against her ribs. Sadness isn't weakness, his mother's words echoed. Her heart pounded so violently she thought the whole camp might hear it. But she moved anyway. Step by careful step. Toward the outpost. Toward danger. Toward choice. She had been sold like a thing. She had been treated like dirt. She had been discarded, betrayed, humiliated. But this she would choose. Her breath misted faintly in the cold, but her eyes burned hot. By the time she reached the crest of the ridge, the night felt sharper, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if she would break again, or if this time she'd fight back. And for the first time since she could remember, she chose herself. The sky was a bruise. Purple bleeding into black, streaked with thin veins of cloud like fingers curling around the stars, suffocating them. Everything Ava had ever known was suffocating her too, right then. The weight of silence, the pressure of choices no one had ever taught her to make. But this time, she wasn't running from pain. She was running toward something. Toward him. Toward the only person who had looked at her without seeing a burden, a failure, or a thing to be traded. Kale. The outpost wasn't guarded well. The soldiers were too arrogant, too used to thinking that their power alone would keep their prisoners obedient. They were drinking, laughing, talking about things men shouldn't laugh about, cruelty hidden in plain conversation, like broken teeth behind false smiles. Ava's breath felt like glass in her lungs as she crouched behind a pile of crates near the stable. Her hands shook, but not with fear, not anymore. It was rage now. Focus. A storm she didn't know she was capable of carrying inside herself. Kale was tied to a post at the center of the camp, wrists raw, dried blood around his knuckles, his dark hair falling loose across his face. His shirt was torn, but his back was still straight. Still proud. Still here. They hadn't broken him. But they were going to try. Two soldiers were playing cards nearby, one half asleep, the other too busy gloating over his hand to care that a girl no one wanted, was about to burn their whole world down. Ava moved before her body had time to argue with itself. One foot, then the next. She could feel the dirt shifting beneath her boots, soft from the recent rain, masking her steps. She didn't have a knife. No gun. Nothing but her hands, her fury, and her memory of everything she'd ever lost. The sleeping soldier never saw her coming. She grabbed the bottle beside him first, not to drink, but to break. It shattered in her grip with a sharp crack, glass biting into her palm, hot blood mixing with cheap whiskey. The other soldier looked up just in time to see a wild, mud-covered, hollow-eyed girl bringing the broken glass down across his arm, making him drop his gun with a yelp more offended than afraid. Kale looked up sharply, recognition flaring in his eyes, but not surprise. Of course she had come. Of course. The second soldier lunged for her, but Ava didn't care. She wasn't fast, but she was angry, and anger made her teeth sharp and her elbows harder than they'd ever been before. He caught her wrist, twisting it painfully, but she didn't scream. She bit him. Hard. His scream tore through the camp like thunder. Chaos. Boots. Shouting. Metal unsheathing. But by then Ava had already scrambled to Kale's side, cutting at the bonds with the edge of a broken horseshoe she'd grabbed from the dirt. Go, she hissed, voice raw, wild, unfamiliar even to herself. Kale didn't argue. The second his hands were free, he moved. Not like a man escaping, but like a force waking up after being still for too long. The shouts grew louder. Shots cracked through the air. But Kale was already pulling her after him, one strong hand curled around her wrist, this time not to hold her down, but to lift her up. They didn't run blindly. Kale knew the land. He cut through the edges of the camp like smoke slipping between fingers, darting between tents, cutting around fires, moving toward the one thing she hadn't noticed before. The horses. They burst into the makeshift corral, startling the animals into wild whinnies and kicks, but Kale was already reaching for the reins of the nearest mount. Ava scrambled up behind him, hands clenched so tight into his torn shirt she thought she might rip it clean apart. Her legs burned. Her lungs screamed. But her heart was alive. As they rode hard into the night, the bullets missing by inches, the angry shouts falling behind them, Ava realized something brutal and beautiful all at once. She was no one's burden. Not anymore. She was a storm. And they hadn't seen it coming. By the time they reached the edge of the hidden canyon, Ava's legs were shaking so badly she thought they might give out. Her breath burned sharp at the back of her throat, every inhale a struggle between panic and exhaustion. The night behind them was full of broken branches, boot prints, shouted threats fading into the dark. But here was something else. Silence. Not the dangerous kind that warns of ambush. The good kind. The kind that feels earned after running for your life. Kale didn't speak as they made their way along a narrow path barely wide enough for the horse. His grip on the reins was steady, but Ava could see the tightness in his jaw, the way his shoulders curved inward slightly. Not fear, not quite defeat, but something heavier. Responsibility. For her. For himself. For everything they'd just broken to stay alive. The path opened suddenly into a hollow surrounded by cliffs of ochre rock, wild grasses swaying in faint currents of night wind. In the center, a single bent cedar tree grew like a sentinel from the earth itself, its branches heavy with time and storms. And by the base of that tree, a glow. A small fire. And beside it, a woman. She rose when they approached, moving like someone who'd been waiting a very long time. Older than Kale by many winters, her hair braided into long silver strands that glinted like water under moonlight. Her skin was weathered, lined not by weakness but by years of watching, surviving, knowing. This was Mira. She said nothing at first. Just studied them both, eyes sharp, steady, not kind, not cruel measuring. Kale dismounted and helped Ava down with more care than should have been possible for someone who just fled for his life. His hands never lingered, but they never rushed either. Myra's gaze drifted to Ava, pausing slightly at the torn dress, the scratches on her arms, the bruises blooming purple along her wrists. "Bring her," Mira said, her voice low and firm like roots speaking through stone. Ava could barely walk, but she followed, the weight of her own defiance still clinging to her like a second skin. They sat by the fire, and Mira handed Ava a wooden cup of something hot and bitter. It smelled sharp, medicinal, filled with things Ava couldn't name, only feel. She drank anyway. Pride was a luxury for people who weren't hunted. Finally Mira spoke, not to Kale, but to Ava directly. "You're not here because someone gave you away." Ava's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to argue, to explain, to apologize for existing. But Mira wasn't finished. "You're here because you were found. Not rescued. Found. A choice, not an accident." Ava stared into the flames, the weight of that sentence pressing down on every part of her that had ever felt small, unwanted, sold like a broken shoe left behind in the rain. Found. Kale sat in silence beside her, not interrupting, not correcting, simply letting it be true. For the first time, Ava didn't feel like a stray object someone had carried out of pity. She felt chosen. Not by the world. Not by fate. By people. Real people who had seen her. The warmth of the drink seeped into her chest, chasing away the shaking, not completely, but enough. Mira leaned forward, her sharp eyes softening only slightly. "You don't owe anyone your life. Not even him. Not even me." Ava swallowed hard. "What do I owe?" she whispered, barely trusting her voice. Myra's answer was immediate, like it had been waiting for years. "Yourself." The word hung there like smoke curling into the stars. Yourself. No man had ever told her that. No parent. No priest. No soldier. Just this old woman by a fire in the mouth of nowhere, reminding her that worth wasn't something given by others. It was taken back, piece by broken piece, until it was whole again. The flames crackled between them, and for the first time since her father had traded her away, Ava didn't feel like a burden. She felt real. Not because of who she'd been before, but because of who she might become now. The firelight danced in Myra's eyes, warm yet fierce, like a flame that had survived storms and still refused to be extinguished. Ava sat across from her, the weight of the night settling heavy on her shoulders. The words Mira had spoken earlier echoed in her mind. "You were found. You were chosen." Ava's hands, still trembling slightly, clasped the carved comb Kale had given her. It was rough in her palm, but real. A symbol of something new, something she wasn't sure she deserved yet. Myra's voice broke the silence again, calm but unyielding. "Pain does not make you weak. Sadness does not make you less." Ava swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the glowing embers, imagining the pieces of her life, the trading, the betrayal, the endless silence, scattering like ashes in the wind. "I have carried many burdens," Mira continued, "but none heavier than the ones we refused to lay down." Ava wanted to speak, to say she was too broken, too lost, that she was only here because the world had no use for her anymore. but the words stuck in her throat. Mira reached out, her rough hands brushing against Ava's, steady and sure. "Choosing yourself is the first act of courage," she said softly. "To claim your worth when all others try to deny it." Ava's breath caught. She had spent so long believing she was nothing more than an object, a thing to be given away, a broken vessel to be discarded. But here, in this hidden haven, those beliefs began to crack. She looked up at Mira, meeting her unwavering gaze, and something shifted deep inside her, a fragile seed of hope, growing roots in soil long thought barren. "You are not what you have suffered," Mira said. "You are what you decide to become." Tears, long buried, welled in Ava's eyes, blurring the firelight. But they were not tears of weakness. They were tears of awakening. For the first time, Ava felt the weight of choice settle on her like a shield, not a chain. She was no longer the girl handed over like a trade. She was a woman who had chosen to stand. Mira smiled, a rare and gentle thing. "Remember this," she whispered. "No one else can give you your worth. You must take it. Claim it. Own it. Every day." The night deepened, the stars wheeling silently overhead, witness to a promise made not to others, but to herself. Ava clutched the comb tighter, feeling its smooth edges press into her palm. Her journey was far from over. But for the first time in her life, she walked it by her own light. The first light of dawn was barely a whisper on the horizon when it shattered like glass. Ava woke to the sound of chaos, shouting, horses snorting, heavy footsteps pounding like thunder against the fragile calm of the canyon. The fire Mira had built just hours before was smothered in ash, its warm glow swallowed by the gray fingers of smoke twisting upward. She scrambled to her feet, heart hammering as the cold bite of fear seized her lungs. Shadows moved fast and cruel, soldiers, their faces hard and unfamiliar, rifles raised without hesitation. Cale was at her side instantly, his hand gripping hers, grounding her even as the world tipped. "We have to move," he said, voice low but urgent. His eyes scanned the ridge, calculating escape routes as if the wilderness itself was a puzzle only he could solve. But the soldiers closed in like a storm, unrelenting and sure. Ava saw Mira standing tall despite the danger, her weathered hands raised in defiance, eyes blazing with the fury of a woman who had fought too long to lose now. The leader of the soldiers barked orders, his words sharp and cold, carving fear into the air. They were here to take Cale, again. To tear apart the fragile peace they had found. Ava felt the weight of every step they took toward them, each one a reminder of the world that refused to see Cale as anything but an enemy. She tightened her grip on Cale's hand, feeling the strength beneath his skin, the silent promise that he would not break, not while she stood with him. As the soldiers drew nearer, Ava stepped forward, the courage Mira had awakened in her now a blazing fire. "No," she said, voice ringing clear despite the chaos. "He is not yours." The word surprised even her, so raw, so fearless. A soldier sneered, raising his rifle, but before he could aim, Cale moved, placing himself between Ava and the threat. But it wasn't enough. Gunshots echoed, sharp and unforgiving, tearing through the air like jagged lightning. Ava ducked instinctively, heart racing, breath ragged. Myra's voice cut through the din, calm and commanding. "This land is not yours to claim with blood." Her words hung heavy in the cold dawn, a challenge that stilled even the soldiers for a breath. And in that brief pause, something shifted. Ava's chest swelled with a fierce, aching hope. They were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for belonging. The clearing fell into a tense silence after Myra's words, the soldiers frozen like statues caught between obedience and doubt. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and earth, but beneath it all something new, something electric, sparked between Ava and the men who sought to claim Cale. Ava took a step forward, her bare feet steady against the rocky ground, eyes blazing brighter than the morning sun filtering through the trees. She could feel every heartbeat pounding like war drums in her chest, every breath steadying her resolve. She lifted her chin, meeting the cold, hard stares with a courage that surprised even herself. "I am his wife," she declared, voice strong and clear, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Not because I have to be. Not because he was traded or because the world decided it for us." She paused, scanning the faces before her, some sneering, some startled, none expecting the defiance radiating from a woman they had all deemed powerless. "I choose him," Ava continued, stepping closer to Kale, their hands finding each other's in a silent pact. "And he chooses me. Together we stand, not as property, not as broken things, but as equals." A murmur rippled through the soldiers, a mix of confusion and anger. The officer's lips twitched into a bitter smile, but he said nothing, as if weighing the consequences of challenging a declaration so raw and unexpected. Kale's eyes locked with Ava's, pride and gratitude shining there, unspoken but palpable. He straightened, his presence anchoring her words, making them impossible to dismiss. One of the younger soldiers shifted uneasily, lowering his rifle slightly. Another sneered, "You think words can change what's written in blood and law?" Ava met his gaze unflinchingly. "Words are the first step. And today, we write a new story." The air crackled with tension, the moment hanging fragile between violence and retreat. Then slowly, the officer nodded once, a sharp, deliberate motion. "Enough," he said, voice cold but final. "You and your husband will come with us. But know this, defiance won't save you." Ava swallowed, heart pounding, but a fierce light blazed within her. She was no longer the girl given away. She was a woman who claimed her place. The heavy silence that followed the officer's words was shattered by the sudden shift in the soldier's demeanor. What had started as cold certainty began to unravel like frayed rope pulled too tight. Ava felt Kale's hand tighten around hers, a quiet strength grounding her, but it was her voice that refused to falter now. "We are not chains to be worn," she said, her tone low but unwavering. "We are not shadows to be erased." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The younger ones looked away, discomfort flickering across their faces, while the older, hardened ones scowled, gripping their weapons tighter. But something had changed. The defiance in Ava's words planted a seed of doubt in the air, a crack in the armor of their unquestioned power. The officer's eyes narrowed, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The courage radiating from Ava was a force he hadn't anticipated, and Kale's steady presence only made it stronger. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, with a gruff grunt, the officer barked a sharp order. "Lower your weapons." Ava's breath hitched, disbelief and cautious hope mingling in her chest. The soldiers obeyed, some reluctantly, others with visible relief, as if the fight had drained from them too. Kale's gaze met hers, a quiet smile touching his lips, a rare softness that spoke volumes. They were not free yet. But the chains had begun to break. In the fading dawn light, Ava stepped forward, feeling the weight of every step as a declaration of survival, of hope. The battle was far from over. But for now, they stood unbound. Together. The first light of dawn filtered gently through the swaying branches, casting a warm golden glow over the small clearing where Ava and Kale had made their new home. The air was fresh, scented with wildflowers and the promise of renewal. Birds sang softly, their melodies weaving through the quiet morning like threads of hope. Ava sat by the fire, her hands busy weaving strips of leather into a small pouch. Each motion was deliberate, steady, a far cry from the trembling hands that had gripped the blanket when she first arrived in Kale's world. The comb Kale had given her lay beside her, a silent talisman of the past mingling with the present. Kale was nearby, sharpening a knife with calm focus. His movements were patient, grounded, a mirror of the peace that had slowly settled over them. He glanced up, catching Ava's eye, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was a smile that spoke of trust, of shared strength, of a future still unwritten but promising. This new life wasn't easy. The scars from their past still ached beneath the surface, the memories of betrayal, the nights haunted by fear. But here, amidst the wild and untamed, they began to build something different. Something sacred. Ava rose and moved toward a small garden patch where herbs and wild vegetables had taken root. She knelt, fingers brushing the soil as if feeling the heartbeat of the earth itself. Growing things needed care, patience, and love, the same things she was learning to give herself. Kale joined her, handing her a handful of seeds. "Life is patient," he said quietly. "It waits for us to be ready." Together, they planted, their hands working in harmony, seeds sinking into the earth like whispered promises. The act felt profound, an assertion that despite everything, they could still nurture growth, create beauty from brokenness. As the sun rose higher, Ava felt a stirring in her chest, a fragile but undeniable feeling of belonging. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. She glanced at Kale, who met her gaze with quiet affirmation. Here in this wild place, they were no longer defined by what had been taken from them. They were defined by what they chose to build. A new life, rooted in strength, watered by courage, and blossoming with hope. The message came with the wind, carried not by words but by the heaviness that settled over the camp like a storm cloud. A rider appeared at the edge of the clearing just as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the worn faces of those gathered. His horse was tired, its flanks slick with sweat, and the man's expression was grave, lips pressed into a thin line. Kale approached slowly, his eyes narrowing as the rider dismounted, holding out a folded parchment sealed with a mark none wished to see. Ava's heart thudded loudly, a wild drumbeat of dread. She had been building her new life from fragments of hope, but this was a fracture that reached deep. The words spilled from the rider's lips, slow and deliberate. News of her father's death. Not peaceful, not forgiven, but alone. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ava's breath caught in her throat, and tears, hot and unbidden, spilled down her cheeks. She hadn't known how much she carried the weight of his rejection until that moment when the world had finally claimed him. Kale's hand found hers, steady and warm, grounding her amid the shock. "You're not the girl he left behind," he said softly, voice breaking the quiet. "You're more." But the ache inside Ava was raw and vast, a hollow carved by years of neglect and now widened by grief. She sank to the ground, clutching the parchment like a fragile thread to a past she thought she'd left behind. The camp around her seemed to fade, the firelight dimming as memories flooded in. The cold nights, the harsh words, the countless times she had been given away as if she were nothing. And yet, beneath the pain, a flicker of something else stirred. A fierce resolve. A whisper rising from the ashes of loss. She would honor the girl her father tried to break, not by succumbing to sorrow, but by living fiercely, fully, freely. With Kale beside her, Ava stood, wiping the tears from her cheeks, her eyes shining with a new kind of strength. The past might be a shadow, but she was the light that refused to be extinguished. The morning air was crisp, carrying the soft scent of earth and dew as Ava knelt by the edge of a small, forgotten grave. The ground was uneven, wildflowers struggling to grow in clumps where the soil was soft and forgiving. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled a handful of delicate seeds from the pouch she had woven herself. Each seed was small, fragile, a promise of life in the face of endings. She had carried the weight of her father's death like a stone in her chest, heavy and cold. But now, as the sun rose over the horizon, warming the valley with gentle light, she felt something shift deep inside her. With careful movements, Ava pressed the seeds into the earth, covering them softly with soil. Her hands were steady despite the storm of emotion swirling within her, a mixture of grief, release, and a tentative hope. Around her, the world was waking. Birds flitted through the branches overhead, their songs bright and clear, as if encouraging the fragile new life she planted. She spoke quietly, almost to herself, words meant to honor and to heal. For the girl you tried to break. For the life you never saw. For the love you never gave. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but this time they were not just sorrow. They were forgiveness, courage, and the gentle acceptance that some wounds could be transformed, not erased, but made part of a larger story. Kale stood behind her, silent but present, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Together, they watched as a breeze stirred the newly planted seeds, scattering loose petals and whispers through the air. Ava looked up at the sky, the clouds parting to reveal a patch of blue, a quiet promise that from endings, new beginnings could grow. She smiled softly, feeling the warmth of the earth beneath her fingers and the strength of the life she was choosing to build. Not just for herself, but for the girl she had been, the woman she was becoming, and the future that awaited them both. The sun was dipping low, bathing the canyon in hues of amber and rose. Ava stood at the edge of the clearing, her fingers still smelling faintly of earth and wildflowers from the morning's planting. The world seemed softer now, touched by the gentle calm of dusk, yet beneath the peace lay the quiet strength of battles fought and won. Kale approached silently, his footsteps muffled on the soft grass. He stopped beside her, his presence steady and warm, like the steady heartbeat she had come to rely on. Without a word he reached out, taking her hand in his, calloused but gentle, and lifted it to his lips. His eyes searched hers, fierce and tender all at once. "No one," he said softly, "will ever give you away again." His voice was a vow, carrying the weight of promises forged in hardship and love. It wasn't just a promise to protect her from others, it was a promise to stand with her, to fight alongside her, to see her as whole and unbreakable. Ava felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from a profound release. The chains of the past, the years of rejection and silence, seemed to dissolve in that single moment. She squeezed his hand, her smile shy but real. "For the first time," she whispered, "I am truly home." Kale pulled her close, their silhouettes framed by the fading light, two souls bound not by duty or fate, but by choice. And as the stars began to pierce the twilight sky, Ava finally believed that love, fierce, unyielding, and free, could heal even the deepest wounds. The morning sun spilled gently over the canyon walls, casting soft golden light across the small cabin where Ava and Kale had built their life. The air was calm, filled with a quiet hum of nature waking, birds chirping, leaves rustling, a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and earth. Ava stood at the threshold, her eyes scanning the horizon as if seeing it for the very first time. Her face, once marked by shadows of pain and doubt, now held a serene glow, an undeniable warmth born from a deep, hard-won peace. She breathed in slowly, the crisp air filling her lungs, and for a moment, closed her eyes. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady, bright, and free. It was the smile she had never thought possible, not a fleeting curve of lips, but a smile that reached into the depths of her soul, a smile that spoke of survival, of healing, of a woman who had reclaimed her story. Kale appeared beside her, silent and strong, his presence a steady comfort. He watched her with a tenderness that made her heart flutter, a quiet celebration of the journey they had shared. "You're home," he said softly, his voice full of wonder and love. Ava nodded, turning to meet his eyes. "Not just a place," she replied, "but a belonging, a choice." Together, they stepped forward into the day, their hands entwined, a promise renewed with every heartbeat. Around them, the world was vast and wild, but for Ava, it no longer felt like a cage or a battlefield. It was a canvas. A place where she could paint her life in colors of courage, love, and freedom. Her smile lingered, radiant and true, a beacon to anyone who had ever been lost and was finally found. From the cold shadow of rejection to the warm light of belonging, Ava's story is a testament to resilience and hope. It's a journey through darkness, where every wound becomes a lesson, every tear a step toward healing. Through trials, loss, and fierce love, she reclaims her worth, transforms her pain into strength, and redefines what it means to be free. This isn't just a story about survival, it's about rising, about standing tall even when the world tries to keep you down. Ava's smile at the end is more than a simple expression. It's the victory cry of a soul finally at peace, a woman who no longer waits for others to give her value but takes it boldly for herself. Her story reminds us all that our past does not dictate our future, and that the power to choose, to love, to fight, to live, is ours alone. If Ava's story moved you, if her strength and courage lit a fire within, don't keep it to yourself. Like, comment, and share this video to spread the message that no one is defined by their past, only by the choices they make. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories that challenge, uplift, and inspire. Remember, your story is still being written, and here, you'll always find the courage to write it boldly.